Let's have a talk, let's have a chat, talking about a little this and that. Hello and welcome to This and That. I am your host, Mary Easterling, and today we are continuing with Bob Newman's Red Flag series, Kingdom versus Kingdom. But before I begin, to listen to the last episode, go to talkingaboutthисandthat.wordpress.com, click on the podcast link, and scroll down to the Red Flag series. Take a look at the Storm series. Storm series is why we're doing the Red Flag series, because this is what's known as storm warnings. All of Bob's stuff is also going to be included on our blog with links to the audio, which opens in another page, so you can listen while you look. In our last episode, we talked about pestilences, sicknesses. The episode before that, we talked about man versus man, and we got into the concept of kingdoms. At that time, we talked about kingdoms as in industries, like the music industry, the movie industry, the arts industry, that sort of thing. In this episode, we're looking at actual national sovereignties as the word kingdom, from the Greek basileia. Bob writes, throughout mankind's long and tumultuous history, war has been a major source of suffering and death. Ancient Greek and Roman mythology describes the god of war as the personification of frail humanity's fears. Such authors' pornographic efforts do not limit themselves to the likes of the Roman Mars or the Greek Ares. Modern buzzwords as havoc, amok, and typhoon berserker all originated from ancient tales of individuals whose exploits were the stuff of nightmares. Fear and terror were the purpose of the deities to whom the practitioner of mayhem worshipped and lived. Today, they still have their counterparts, but the venue seems to be changing. Quote-unquote war appears to have lost its luster as the technology of man has advanced. Likewise, improvement in tactics decreased the individual efforts. A strange equality has been birthed. Individual abilities and coverage always took a back seat to technology. As rock and stone fell prey to bronze, so bronze eventually fell to iron and steel. As individuals fell to large numbers, so did massed warriors fall to disciplined soldiers. Tactics and strategies changed with time slowly, only to accelerate suddenly and unexpectedly. Even Shakespeare documented one of these sentimental moments in mankind's evolution. The play, Henry IV, portrays the battle of any in court. In this small area of France, the ultimate example of chivalry, the masked French cavalry, all knights in shining armor, rode off the battle. The aristocracy of glorious France assembled in response to their Dauphin, the Prince of France, with quote-unquote superior armament, numerical quote-unquote superiority, and quote-unquote righteous cause. They advanced with their victory, quote-unquote, assured. But there are more variables than armor, numbers, and incentive. Terrain, meteorology, and technology favored the British. In rain and mud, cavalry lost its advantage. In fog and mist, it lost its cohesion. What French knight who was not felled by the long bows of the English yeomen fell to their pikes, swords, and axes? The gods of war were greatly served in the most one-sided battle in history. And it was a battle, man of war versus man of war. Technology today has removed that possibility. This 20th century is the century of two world wars. It is also the century of refugees, friendly fire, collateral damage, and mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction, or MAD, is the bastard child of technology and global power. It was birthed into the abstraction called the Cold War. Coined in the stalemate between East and West, it epitomized the awkward balances that technology established. Thermonuclear war was seen by the secular world as, quote unquote, Armageddon, a literal doomsday where nuclear winter would be the ultimate victor. Interestingly, as man turned to technology to provide an alternative to battle in the thermonuclear age, the neutron bomb destroyed life, but left inanimate objects intact. Star Wars anti-missile warhead research might supply a theoretical defense support to the strategic first strike capabilities. Yeah, no, that ain't happening. That initiative has died. Or has it? What is in some of the stuff that gets sent up to the space station, quote unquote? I leave that for you to ponder. Laser and pulse beam / particle beam research and development continued today. In the heat of the Cold War, an expanded arsenal of probability was needed. So biological / chemical genetic weaponry was espoused. But now they're no longer needed. Global peace and prosperity, love and happiness are at the door. Just listen to your politicians. I insert. Funny how this has been hinted at right now, with two very divergent theaters of war in stages of being ended by our quote-unquote great and much beloved POTUS. Yes, we will be acquiring Gaza, so the refugees will be going to Egypt and Jordan. But POTUS doesn't say how without us paying for it. Oh, wait, remember the Great Wall at the border? Who paid for that? We did. Mexico gave us nothing. Then POTUS, now POTUS, said Mexico would pay, but they didn't. Now he's gonna, quote unquote, do it again. And we will be eating the bill of a sovereign territorial takeover without boots on the ground. Eh? The other is Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine will be giving up a bit of itself to Putin. Oh, Vladdy is so happy. Our darling, quote-unquote, POTUS is back. But did you know that they say Putin is fiscally in bed with Iran and the less popular Korea when it comes to war? You know, Kim Jong-un's Korea? Right, that Korea. Not the other Korea. His Korea. I thought I'd clarify that. Yes, Biden wanted no part of Putin not being shut out of Kyiv, but Trump wants talk. Eventually, Putin will get all of Kyiv and move on to the next place. If these two wars manage to touch, well, right now we are in World War III. Yes, you heard me say it. We are. Think about it. But so far, it's limited to more words than bullets. But make no mistake, it's coming. The bullets, that is. Lots and lots of bullets. Bob writes. And it doesn't seem to matter where in the quote-unquote free world you might live. Only little of the world appears now to be free. One of the problems of the Cold War and MAD was it did change the nature of man. When technology prevented conflict, the followers of the gods of war changed tactics, strategies, and venues. Between 1945 and 1988, East/West, communism/capitalism, changed the venue from direct confrontation to quote-unquote surrogate war. The quote-unquote game was created around some global hotspot where each superpower took a side in the local conflict. Wait! Ukraine! No. Ukraine! While Biden was in office, we were on one side lobbing bullets at Russia, while Russia, are they running out of bullets, or did they just want to beef it up? Well, actually, no. Russia had a lot of people leaving the ranks because they were like, this is stupid, Putin. We're getting hammered here. So he goes to Kim Jong-un's Korea and gets them to come over and help him. As Biden is leaving, the rockets are racing. They're not thermonuclear, but they do pack a punch. Okay. Maybe this is one of those surrogate wars. Bob writes, each would send quote unquote aid and quote unquote advisors. Sometimes troops were committed. Global one-upsmanship played out in the concept of a guerrilla, quote unquote, or quote unquote little war. For many years, American citizens heard the word quote unquote guerrilla and could not understand how apes were involved. But if you heard it on the TV, it had to be right? And it's not gorilla as in, it's guerrilla as in small, guerrilla. It's a Latin word, actually, or a Spanish word, I think, because when I look at the spelling, that's what it looks like to me, is Spanish. So, and a variant of the concept of little or compact. That's my 2 cents. I'm not sure if Bob will talk about this, but there was this movie called Global Thermonuclear War. Or, I can't even remember. I do not remember the name. Maybe it was the game. It opens with 2 kids who have hacked into a military thing. And as these kids have hacked into this server, you see that comes across the screen, quote unquote, shall we play a game? To their horror, they discover almost too late to save humanity that this is a simulator game meant to play endlessly until it finds the right combo to win. As the movie's ending, you've got the big war room, and the kids are being shown what this thing does all day. The screen lights up, or the screens in the room light up, with scenario after scenario showing the total annihilation of both and or all sides. The message, this is a no-win scenario. That is true. Dirty bomb tactics won't work, but recently as the election ground on, someone TikToked a little gem. They were on this fear rant about the fact that once one of those bombs goes off, no more bombs will go off because they won't be able to. Now, folks, I went Googled it. You know what? They're onto something. They're seriously onto something. Of course, you can't feed something to a suicide bomber to drive the payload to detonate it in enemy territory either, because the truck won't run. I'm talking about an EMP, electromagnetic pulse. It fries all the electronics. Could this be why there are no bombs being sent to kill? Is quote-unquote arty. Those of you that have been listening to this Neumann series by now might understand who I'm talking about when I talk about arty. Those of you that don't, think AI. So is arty in a sandbox mainframe playing a game trying to determine this little EMP war? Is arty, quote-unquote, learning that this too might be a non-starter war? Yes, EMP is not something you can easily Faraday cage away. It will fry all the electronics, including the ones in the hospitals or your pacemaker. Talk about your basic collateral damage. That little moment will put us back to the pre-industrial era. My advice, candles and the Bible. Not bad lighting indoors and best book ever. Bob writes, depending on what side of the fence you stood, the combatants of the quote-unquote guerrilla warfare took on astoundingly different characteristics. If you were supportive of their efforts, for whatever reason, they become daring, charismatic, even romantic freedom fighters, independent partisans rising up against the great aggressor to restore peace, safety, and freedom to your countrymen. They overcame great odds through great sacrifice. Of such are the legends of William Tell, Robin Hood, Joan d'Arc, and the Scarlet Pimpernel. Again, depending on your point of view, modern quote-unquote legends might include Walesa of Poland, Pavel of Czechoslovakia, Gandhi of India, Ben-Gurion and Begin of Israel, quote-unquote Marshall, Tito of Croatia and Yugoslavia, Mao of China, Castro, Noriega, the Ayatollah Khomeini, Saddam Hussein, etc. Oh, that got dark. Geez, Bob, we're not rooting for those. Depends on what side of the fence you're on. Somebody was rooting for him. You can't get guns and bullets unless somebody's rooting for you, folks. Bob writes, I think you get my point. One man's patriot freedom fighter could be another's saboteur, assassin, or terrorist. It all depends on who wins and who writes the history books, or it used to. In America, quote-unquote, history has an adversary called, quote-unquote, redaction. Much of history is being rewritten as the, quote-unquote, memory begins to fade. Regrettably, it is difficult to spot who is responsible for this changing of history. But it is obvious the American people are the opposition. I have to interject. It's been said, if you forget your history, if you don't learn the lessons of your history, you're doomed to repeat it. If you redact and rewrite your history because your elders are going away and you're not teaching your young ones the stories to keep the history alive and correct, well, those that are doing the history changing have got you right where they want you. Last time this didn't work, but our history tells us how we were defeated. We won't tell them all the story, so they won't do that again. This time we'll win. Aha, aha. Bob writes, so it is necessary to study the technology, tactics, and strategies of the quote-unquote little war. Because of its nature, the quote-unquote guerrilla war is one that attempts to change a balance of power without head-to-head conflict. Tactically, it pits a smaller, weaker group against the present government/culture/society. So the idea of anonymity is important. If a government does not know who to fight, it is powerless to even strike at its enemy. The principal weapons of anonymity are misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda. This diminishes effective creation and deployment of any counterinsurgence measures by the quote-unquote government. The second tactic of this quote-unquote guerrilla war is attrition. To damage the strength and literal structure of the quote-unquote government. Attrition can be anything from debasing the economy to disrupting the infrastructure. Assassination and sabotage are weapons of attrition that can lead to the third major tactic of warfare, and that is terrorism. The goal of the quote-unquote guerrilla is to overthrow the present government/culture/society. One means of doing so is to either win the support of the common people, and if not, to destroy their will to resist the insurrectionists. If misinformation and propaganda fail to move the people, fear will. That is the sole purpose of terrorism. Sometimes it works. Look at, quote-unquote, modern Israel and Afghanistan. But, quote-unquote, victory takes a price. Ask a Mujahideen or a Maccabee. Yet terrorism by itself has never overthrown any government. A quote-unquote terrorist act, by definition, is to create fear as it damages present authority, to blow up a power plant, bridge, facility, factory, rail line, quote-unquote disrupts more than, quote-unquote, frightens. But to, quote-unquote, attack the people is a sign of a terrorist. Quote-unquote fear is created by exposing vulnerability. But who? In the perfect world of Hollywood, the insurrectionists seem to be attempting to restore quote-unquote freedom, to either throw out an external/aggressor or to overthrow a corrupt or tyrannical government. Yet historically, the Cold War created few heroes but many victims, and it continues until today. And it continues even now, although there isn't a Cold War anymore. It's hot over there. Except that Putin is not fighting us. He's fighting Zelensky. Yee. Bob writes, today terrorism can be a tactic of many possible causes, but we need to look at only three. First, of course, is to restore freedom to a conquered people, or to regain a quote-unquote homeland. Second is to overthrow a government and to replace it in some way. Third is simple anarchy, for either for profit or pleasure. The first and second cause for terrorism has a purpose that is simply understood because it has a goal. The third tends to be the quote-unquote Pandora's box, a possibilities and probabilities. I want to put this thought forward, and y'all think about it. What if one's government is the terrorist, but they welcomed in and, in fact, are heavily supporting their terrorists? What if the people that government is harming have no clue that this is the quote-unquote hidden agenda? How many nations or political parties are undergoing this right now? Bob writes, there was once a time when the world anarchists brought vivid mental pictures of a wild-eyed fanatic who caused death and destruction for unimagined reason or cause. Anarchy, by definition, is a state where all rules of conduct are suspended, all bets are off. In the previous century, literature described the anarchist as a quote-unquote madman with a bomb. Before there were serial killers and mass murderers, we had anarchists, long-haired, bearded, quote-unquote bohemians, whose only desire was to upset the apple cart, or so they were pictured. Now that we have laid the quote-unquote foundation on terrorism and terrorists, let's look at recent events in America. Let us go back to the World Trade Center and planned bombings of New York City. This is how Bob sees it. Supposedly, the FBI was aware of activities prior to the bombing and quickly moved afterwards against certain Islamic fundamentalists. In Oklahoma City, a bomb went off and quickly suspects were arrested. A value jet aircraft went down in the Everglades. Quote-unquote equipment failures believed. A TWA aircraft goes down in the Atlantic. No answer has yet been given. Oh, planes, trains, and video games. How many planes have been going down? They're just falling out of the sky right now. The Nighthawk and the small passenger jet. Poor little jet coming in for a landing. These other guys are wearing their goggles and cruising down the river at the wrong height. Whoops. Smack! Ooh, lots of casualties there, including the guys that were flying the chopper. My jury's still out to lunch as to exactly what was really, truly going on, but they are already crafting the perfect explanation. I guarantee you what. So, Bob writes, a bomb goes off in Atlanta. One suspect is mentioned and then ignored by the authorities, but not the media. Now, where is the quote-unquote common thread between them? By nature, when a quote-unquote guerrilla goes to the point of requiring terrorist acts, either the cause is nearly won or it is hopeless. In the first case, a ruthless act of terror will get a dictator to abdicate or an enemy to withdraw. The second case is to show that the quote-unquote cause has not died, but it basically has. You may call it a vengeful act. So-called insurgent calls it a quote-unquote parting shot, not quickly forgotten. It is in their light that when a bomb goes off somewhere in the world, the news media is quote-unquote contacted by quote-unquote alleged groups who take claim for the terrorist act. A number of years ago, a quote-unquote pipe bomb exploded in an European airport terminal. Within 24 hours, a major wire service documented that the act of terrorism was claimed by at least 8 separate groups. Irish Republican Army, the PLO, Red Brigades of Italy, Basque Separatists Group, Greek Royalist Group, the German Baader Meinhof quote-unquote gang, and the quote-unquote Green Party activist who would not disclose his or her country of origin. It is interesting that so many causes openly desire credit for killing and maiming quote-unquote innocent people, especially when authorities apprehended the bomber. An employee had been fired was quote-unquote getting even. Shades of the United States Postal Service. In the first 24 hours of both the World Trade Center and Oklahoma City bombings, the media mentioned a claim for each from an quote-unquote Islamic group, but only briefly. No other claims were quote-unquote reported. But were any claims made? Nor has the media reported such claims in either crash or the Atlanta bombing. This goes against the quote-unquote nature of a terrorist, whether factual or bogus. If they are all acts of an anarchist, quote-unquote, he is not the madman, megalomaniac we would expect to see. So that tends to leave out the quote-unquote pleasure variable. Imagine a group or person exceptionally competent, technically and professionally disciplined, acting in an area of terrorism on behalf of the highest bidder. Ooh. Yet both maintaining anonymity. All this does is to bring us completely full circle. Is there an unseen kingdom, quote unquote kingdom, openly contesting for the expulsion of an invading power who has conquered and enslaved the people of the United States while we were asleep or not looking? That obviously is not the apparent situation. So in spite of what either the Democrats or the Republicans might say at their conventions, the forceful overthrow of a despotic tyrant does not seem underway. So what remains? Over the years, who has not heard of some strange conspiracy coming from outside and from inside our very government? Some have been more far-fetched, while a few were quite intriguing. What usually eliminated these theories were that those who came forward to warn us of the impending dooms, quote unquote, granted before most got their 15 minutes in the spotlight, they had borne the brand of fanatic, lunatic, and crackpot. And where did those titles come from, our friends? In the Fourth Estate. Then again, the media itself and how it has slowly evolved into the molder of messages rather than just a messenger is suspect. Point in fact, whenever a coup d'etat would take place, the central objective would be to capture all areas of media and control. Political control does not come only by military and police control, but the economical and popular power. The radio and television links give the coup access to the people, both for the dissemination of information and propaganda. Most military and political strategists saw this not only as the key failure of the Soviet coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, but as the linchpin of the quote-unquote charade. All tactical experts agree that no effort was made to either control or to shoot down both the local and international media. In fact, they agreed that the protection, quote-unquote, of international media and their satellite uplinks proved that the quote-unquote coup was, quote-unquote, a staged event, merely Russian theater at its highest. But little was said over the media that would cause disbelief to spring up. All contrary thoughts took time to filter through the channels. Enough to me that Gorbachev was out, Yeltsin was in, and those who quote-unquote staged the coup were dealt with. Unknown, invisible men were safely out of sight. Obvious, the Soviet/Russian bear had truly changed. The quote-unquote evil empire birthed by Stalin and Lenin dealt speedily with all those who rose up against it, and they met eternity in the bowels of Lubyanka prison, or a shallow grave in Siberia, not in the summer house in Crimea. For nearly 40 years, the kingdoms in conflict were simple to distinguish. East versus West, communism versus democracy, socialism versus capitalism were simply labels for the two systems that vied for world domination. Our side was based in quote-unquote Washington, while the other was based in quote-unquote Moscow. But because of the technological advances to the stage of mutually assured destruction, global conflict became limited to the surrogate level. Basically, you could play one side against the other, but ultimately all played by a strange set of rules. As the Cold War ended between the two powers, local instability occurred when, quote-unquote, nationalism filled the power void. So who would gain from any form of terrorist act against the American people? Who would benefit by attacks against the American power grid or infrastructure? What is left is a quote-unquote conspiracy so advanced and developed that victory is assured. The anarchist theory of terrorism for pleasure or profit no longer fits because the megalomaniac wants recognition for his acts. That is his source of pleasure. Likewise, the profit ideal falls because while the perpetrators would seek anonymity, the quote-unquote customer would seek the media to chin the credit. Literally, notoriety based on the size of the quote-unquote bang for their quote-unquote bucks. Crude humor, but accurate. That leaves only scapegoats and surrogates to ponder. Samuel. This ends Bob's writing. I'm adding this. You do with it what you want. Right now we have a POTUS and a new title, DOGE. Department of Government Efficiency. An inefficient government would be run out on a rail by voters. But Biden/Harris was run out by MAGA. Meanwhile, DOGE is openly shutting down, possibly openly shutting down. Let's put the word possibly in there, because so far, doors to actual agencies aren't actually closed. But boy, the layoffs have happened. Oh, I'm sorry. They're not even laying them off. They're just firing them. So you can't collect anything. There is no net for these people. Pray for them. So he's openly shutting down, or at least disrupting, all these pesky agencies that are roadblocks to, quote-unquote, drill baby drill and screw with the drill bit, the ecology. And tariffs, in order to hold down prices, means that American-made is cheap, shoddy garbage. You're going to have to hold down the prices. So once you shift to the American-made, and the prices have to stay down, but the tariffs for your stuff that you need to work with, because not everything that you're working with is American-made, are going to force you to cut corners in order to lower the price, to reduce your workforce and overwork what's left in order to keep your productivity up but lower your price. In the end, you get cheap, shoddy garbage. But once you bought it and it failed in ways too spectacular to consider, you may now have nowhere to go to. For the government oversights of accountability may be, or actually are, gone. I wonder how long it will be before the screams of the elderly are heard when the quote-unquote checks stop coming. The doctors walk away, and for the first time ever, the hospitals will not admit the elderly without proof of ability to pay up front. You think I'm off? What do you think will happen when two of our big three closes? Social Security, which the Republicans want to overhaul by shutting it down, and Medicare, closed doors. Nursing homes will throw yo mama to the curb, but they will keep her valuables. In less than 24 hours after a confirmed shutdown, the nasty smell will be on all faces. Then comes the homelessness and the dying. But hey, useless eaters unite, so we can kill you quicker. I sound ghastly, but this is your government, and you just voted in a guy who right now is holding back a Republican-dominant House and Senate, which is a first. We haven't had this in a long time. From doing just that, closing those two, and then Medicaid, of course, as well. No, there's an agenda, and has been for years. The great war of all wars has been playing out, and we've been playing with it. The war of words. But the time for talk has ended. The Brits had theirs, and a Scotty lady mentioned we are about to have ours. Hats off to you, lassie, because here we go. And that is it for this episode of This and That. In our next episode, we will be continuing Bob Neumann's Red Flag series with Fire and Rain.